A warm welcome to all of you who are gathering. We're now over 650 people. And I wonder if you could, I know some are already doing so, if you could just note your name and which country you're from. There's nothing better than for all of us to realize that there is a benefit to virtual, which is that we get to be together on a global scale, which is something that we appreciate more than perhaps we ever have. I want to welcome Paul Tripp, who is from AceUp. So for some of you who may not be members of the Institute of Coaching, we are completely funded by donations and volunteer work like me. I volunteer my time to lead co-lead the Institute. And AceUp is at this point our largest financial sponsor. I think more than $75,000 last year. And so that covers a lot of work we do in bringing good, if not great, coaching science and coaching research to the field of coaching. Our topic today is something that is very much aligned to coaching science and research, which is being able to understand the outcomes of what we do and bring the discipline to what coaches do in terms of thinking about outcomes, measuring them, showing what works and doesn't work. And so we're very grateful to AceUp for assembling an amazing group of panelists today. And let me just, oops, sorry, I lost my screen. Let me just briefly introduce our esteemed panelists, all for whom this is not just a passing interest and something you think about when you have to. This is the core of their work. And without them, we would be adrift in terms of having this kind of session. I'm going to go alphabetical order. I'm going to start with Lisa Edwards, who is a partner of Bloom Coaching Institute. I love the notion of bloom, especially as it's springtime. An award-winning executive coach whose unique skill set includes cultivating excellence in others while delivering tangible results. And her particular abilities have led to measurable ROI of more than 250% and lifting employee engagement by nearly 20%. Those are pretty hard numbers, Lisa. As a globally respected collaborator, author, speaker, obviously many hats you wear, Lisa. Her organization, myexcelia.com, is dedicated to tracking and measuring ROI of coaching, of leadership development, and consulting. And Lisa's organization is one of the few entrepreneurial businesses supported as an official advisor from Zuckerberg Media. We all know who that's about. Lisa's client ROI projects include all the big names, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Gates Foundation, Pinterest, Gusto, Federal Reserve, and on and on. Let me stop there. So thank you, Lisa, a warm welcome. We're so glad you're here. Next is Nadine Greiner, who is a human resources executive and a coach with a passion for helping organizations grow through creating amazing experiences for their employees. She is currently the Chief Human Resources Officer at the Institute of Aging and has formerly served in executive positions in companies like Sutter Health. And just by the way, Nadine, we are in the healthcare space. You might know that the Institute of Coaching sits at McLean Hospital, which is an affiliate of Harvard Medical School. So your background there is really well-placed. Uplift Family Services and VMware. Dual PhD, that's no small feat, in organizational development and clinical psychology, as well as being a certified senior professional human resources professional, change leader, mediator. Nadine, you help organizations and executives with everything to do with people. She's written 2 books, The Art of Executive Coaching and Stress-Free Leadership, and writes regularly for ATD, SHRM, Entrepreneur Magazine, and Thrive. In fact, Nadine, you were telling us earlier, you presented your terrific formula on the ROI of coaching just recently to the ATD's annual conference of 10,000 participants right before the pandemic. And last but not least is Tanya Moore, who has more than 20 years of consulting and HR experience in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors, specializing in strategic workforce management, talent transformation, complex talent transformation, reskilling, employee experience, employee engagement, or organizational change, training, composition. So basically, the entire 360-degree repertoire of HR activities. She is currently the Chief People Officer for MC Dean, which I just noticed is about more than 5,000 employees, an MBA from William and Mary, where she specialized in OD, and is on the William and Mary Consulting Board of Directors, the Virginia CareerWorks Northern Regional Board of Directors, and a Harvard Business Review Advisory Council member. So Tanya, you speak on all kinds of topics relate to transforming the skills of workforces, HR in the digital age, and using artificial intelligence to advance HR. So that is one hell of a bunch of CVs here today. So we're in for a great conversation. And with that, without further delay, Paul, over to you.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to share my screen here. I have to say, so I was a registered participant. James is the better looking version of me. Unfortunately, he had to bow out at the last minute. So I did step in today for James. And so I'm not James Lopata, but I am very passionate about the ROI of coaching. As a previous CFO, I registered for the webinar to learn and listen like all of you. And I have to say, I've seen people in here from China, from Germany, from Italy, from Sweden. Lisa, lots of people who were certified in ROI under you. There's been lots of comments about that in the chat boxes. So we have a great audience and I'm excited. So I'm just going to start this off by asking all of you, what are you hoping to get out of today's discussion? And I'm just going to pause there for a minute. While you write your comments in so we can capture those. So as I ask questions today of our panelists, I can make sure to capture what it is that you're hoping to get out of today's discussion. I'm going to take about 5 minutes as you type in your comments in the chat box to really kind of set up what is ROI, just provide a baseline. I'm going to kind of introduce you to the room, talk about what ROI is, and maybe add some concepts around that. And then I'm going to turn it over to the panelists and ask them some questions. My goal is to get out of the way in 5 minutes and really allow their expertise to teach all of us, which I'm really excited about. So let me just look at some of the, are you all seeing some of the chat? What's the most relevant way to present ROI to potential clients, providing healthcare CEOs a way to anticipate ROI? Excellent. Okay. So what is ROI? So for all of you who don't know, that's return on investment. And what does ROI mean? Well, it's really a way to divide the gains of your investment by your investment cost, and that is the ROI. So the gain of an investment is really what we're going to talk about today. If you had invested $100,000 in a coaching program as a company, how do you measure that return? And it's really about the gain that you're going to get from the investment. Some of the ways we think about that, or that have been bantered about in terms of a gain, are employee behavior, new knowledge, retention, job satisfaction. And of course, all of those things are difficult to measure, which is what I hope the panelists are going to explain today. And each one has a different methodology. And when we talk about a shift in the engagement, I worked at a pharmaceutical company recently who had a growth mindset as the measure that they wanted to achieve. And when we got into the group coaching, it was a shift to psychological safety. And so if the measure was initially set here and we had an outcome shift in the middle, then how do you measure the ROI, right? That's something that I'll also want to dive in today with the panelists. And shifts like that are common. And when you think about a blind scientific test of coaching, the way I know now is surveys, right? Baseline survey in the beginning, baseline survey at the end, and then what's the difference? But panelists, I can't wait to hear your thoughts. So that's kind of the setup for ROI and why it's so difficult. When we think about the possibilities for measuring ROI, often inputs are the starting point. Clients often want to look at coaching interventions as a way to measure the ROI of an engagement. And I think of an input as putting the gas in the car to go on a vacation, and then you never leave because the tank is full. That's a starting point. It's not an outcome or an output. So I'm really curious to hear Dr. Nadine, Tanya, and Lisa, your thoughts on the possibilities for measuring ROI. So it really goes inputs, outputs, some new behaviors, increase in productive time for yourself and teams, as well as higher engagement for stakeholders. That's a value creation, but how is that quantifiably measured or understood? So we put together a chart here to kind of show you, when you think about ROI, there are really 4 different ways to look at it across the spectrum: the input, the output, the outcomes, and then the value creation. And the panelists are probably chomping at the bit to dive into this. So I will say that when a coaching engagement occurs, in this slide here, there are many different players. And I think there are different insertion points to look at how you measure a coaching engagement. You can look at a coaching engagement from an organizational perspective. What are some of the organizational goals? You can look at it from the leadership and development segment. What are some of their goals? And then what are some of the individual goals? And how do you align those goals across the coaching engagement to define ROI? And you'll see in this graphic here, you have internal coaches, you have external coaches, you have a coaching supervisor, as well as the employee. And so with all of those moving parts and pieces, how do you measure ROI? How is it possible? And what's the starting point? What we know is executive coaching works. There have been many papers written. HBR has several articles. I know Forbes does. I believe the Wall Street Journal put out a fantastic article on executive coaching and how it works. So I want to dive into the panelists with that setup and just kind of getting us on the same page and really ask you, and Lisa, I'll start with you. What is your philosophical approach to ROI?
Yeah, such a great question. And first of all, I want to say hello to everyone. I see a lot of familiar names in the chat box there. And so welcome. It's great to be reconnected. And I see a lot of new names too. So I think, this topic is potentially a very complex topic. And I think we may even see that today when we hear from all of the panelists and the different points of view. While there might be some similarities and some overlaps, it's potentially a very complex kind of topic. And my approach around ROI is to make it accessible and easy to get started. We can always make the approach more complex, more robust, but my concept around measuring ROI is to make it easy for people to get started. I came to this work because I had a couple different turning points in my career. One was that I had a coaching program that I taught at a community college. It was called Bloom Where You're Planted, Finding Purpose in Your Work and Life. I thought it was very fluffy. I certainly didn't think any business would invest in that program. This was way back in 1999. But I started noticing some things about that program that made me think, I wonder if I take this to a company, if I ran a pilot study, could I actually see the financial impact or the value that this program has to a company? And I was able to show that. A little bit further on in my career, I worked in a Bill Gates global media company here in the Seattle area where I lived. And at the time, all of our senior executives had an executive coach. We had 22 senior executives, 22 coaches all around the world. We knew their names. Coaching was highly embraced, but then coaching was cut because of some challenges that we were facing in the industry. I was able to bring coaching back to the organization by showing the overall value. So I certainly think that ROI can be measured, and we can measure both non-financial metrics, things like how feelings shift, how happiness shifts, how confidence shifts. We can also look at how behavior change grows or progresses over that period of time. And then, of course, we can look at financial impacts as well. What I have learned over the years is that not every engagement has a financial impact, and that is okay. We don't want to force ROI on our engagements. We would lose our ability to be credible in the marketplace or with our decision makers if we're forcing an ROI on every single engagement. So I like to take that pressure off of measurement. So that's a little bit about my approach to ROI and how I think about it.
Excellent. So what I heard you say is you believe that ROI should be accessible and easy to start.
Mhm.
There are financial and non-financial measures, and really not every engagement should be mandated, right, to have an ROI measure.
Correct. That's how I see it.
Dr. Nadine, how about you? What's your philosophical approach to ROI?
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everybody. Thank you to Paul and Margaret for inviting us, and hello to Lisa and Tanya. It's a joy to be on this panel with you, and hello to the thousands all over the world. I have a dual PhD in organization and clinical psychology. So when I first started studying the ROI 20 years ago, I think I went down many rabbit holes. I did regression analyses, I did causation analyses. I mean, I really kind of went to town. And just over the last 5 years, right about when I was writing The Art of Executive Coaching, I took a whole different tact. And I really boiled it down to 4 different ways to measure the ROI. And my philosophy is that if we are going to be good practitioners and good stewards of this process, we should always be looking to measure ROI, whether it's asked of us or not. Coaching is part art, part science, and I'm glad we're focusing on the science even when nobody's really asking us. So the 4 different ways, I'll just kind of go on depth maybe with 1 or 2 of them, but the first one is the employee life cycle. So and I put together kind of like 9 different aspects of the employee life cycle. And feel free to put the link to the downloadable deck, Paul, if you want, on my website, if people want to go ahead and see the full ATD presentation that I did in Washington, DC to 10,000 participants. It's a little geeky, but I think the folks in the audience will find at least some of it useful, and feel free to use any and all of it. So the return on investment with this first approach here in philosophy is that the needs of the coaching client are very different, whether it's the first 90 to 120 days on a job when people are onboarding. It's different whether they're getting a new level or area of responsibility or elevated leadership. High potentials have their own needs as well. Maybe it's a phase where we're looking at succession planning or preparation for succession planning. Maybe it's a business need that the company has, maybe a new office opening in a new location or a new line of service. Maybe it's individual or situational, or maybe there's some unwanted behaviors there that the executive has, kind of what used to be known as remedial coaching, actually my favorite. Or maybe this is an employee who we want to retain and want to reward with some coaching. So the ROI, going back, Paul, to your initial 5 chevrons there, is of course it would look very different if you're a new employee being onboarded, and new leader and who wants an executive coach to come in and understand the culture, understand the lay of the land, build the relationships, than somebody who's opening up a new office across the world. So that's one of the 4 ways that I started to really kind of break it down. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. There's 3 other ways that we can talk about if we get around to it.
Yeah, so I appreciate, I've shared your link for your white paper, and I heard you say, employee life cycle. You talked about financial measure and competency, but really you understand it from the employee life cycle. That's one of the 4 ways that you measure in your philosophical approach to ROI? Tanya, what about you? Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, there's a couple things, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but to me, there are a lot of different types of coaching now. And again, I won't go into that now, but there's the one-on-one executive coaching or other types of coaching. And then there's also this concept of a coaching culture. So how do you coach an organization? How do you coach a cadre of people? And so my point of view is you absolutely can have an ROI. I'm pretty consistent with Lisa's point of view. 2, it can be qualitative and or quantitative. And I do think both are very important. 3, I don't think there always will be one, or you don't always need one. And then 4, I think the thing that's most important is finding an ROI, and I'm seeing some questions, is it ROE, return on equity, or ROI? I'm kind of one of these people that doesn't get tied up around words because it's the crux of it that matters. Either way, you're focusing on the value. So the value to the individual or the value to the company, and making sure whatever metrics you choose are metrics that really matter, as opposed to kind of getting lost in some of the noise of the activity of creating ROI itself. That's kind of my philosophical point of view.
So Tanya, I heard you say you take a coaching culture approach to ROI. Is that right?
So I would broaden this. I take a coaching culture approach, period. So and I might be leading you into your next question, so tell me if you want me to hold on. I'm not trying to.
You might as well. Yeah.
But I think coaching of individuals is incredibly important. And I have personally benefited from it myself. I have seen my clients and others benefit from it. And I think as we look at how we as organizations need to transform, and those that have been transformed and are transforming have been successful, you're starting to hear concepts about coaching cultures, the culture of learning, the culture of growth. And to actually achieve those cultures, it's less about the programs itself you put in place, and it's more about the culture, the mindset, the behaviors that are actually there as a result, which in the end are, how do we coach each other? How can peers coach peers? How do you coach people to grow and develop new skills? So to me, it's how do you start thinking about coaching at scale and complementary of one-on-one coaching is kind of where my head is. And then how does that then equate to different ROI, like an increase in revenue, a decrease in cost, increased internal movement of people, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so that does lead me to my next question is, the ROI, quantifiably measuring ROI. And of course, quantifiably, Lisa, you had talked about, there's financial and non-financial measures. And so, the quantifiable piece would be more tied around the financial piece, something that's concrete, right? Like a cost reduction or market share gain. And so I'll let Tanya or Lisa, who wants to jump in first, since you're on either end?
Let Lisa go.
Okay, Lisa, let's hear it.
Okay, so what's the question?
Yeah, what makes you think that ROI can be quantifiably measured? Like, can you give us some examples or your understanding of it?
Yeah, so in our approach, and by the way, let me just say, I work primarily with individual coaches or coaches who either run coaching programs within organizations or they're external service providers and they work with organizations. So unlike Tanya's scenario where she's working with a system, and I think the approach is different than what I might talk about. So I wanted to clarify that. And so in our approach, the way that we land on the financial metrics, and some of you will know this, is through the money talk. And the money talk is a conversation framework that I developed no different than the GROW model is a conversation framework. So the Money Talk is a conversation framework that allows a coach to debrief with their client what's changed, how have they changed or grown over the period of time that they've worked with their coach. So are they a better influencer? Are they a better communicator? Are they better at engaging their team? And then listening for those changes to then be able to pinpoint specific examples. We always look for the examples. I always say the money's in the example. Listen for examples that can be monetized. So that's how we land on it on the individual level. And then we also have a second step where then we get those financial metrics validated by somebody else in the organization. But that's how we capture the financial data on an individual level, because we're working with individuals. And I'm imagining Tanya is going to have a different way that she might look at this because she's working with a system.
And so if, let's say that you are coaching, me as an individual, and, my communication has improved, right? And you say, okay, are you then listening for the money side of that?
Typically, typically. So typically the coach is listening. We offer training where they learn how to use the Money Talk. But we're listening for what those changes are. And then we're listening for specific examples that lead us to think, oh, they're more efficient. They were able to influence a decision in a team meeting. And that decision that was made is a cost savings to the organization, or it's an innovation that's going to drive additional revenue, or they were able to influence decision makers faster than what they were normally able to influence. So they were able to realize that impact for the organization 3 months sooner. So we're listening for that and then helping the coachee quantify it. It's highly unlikely that the coachee is going to show up in that debrief conversation and say, I got $500,000 ROI. They're not going to show up with that. We have to walk them through the thinking process and help them reflect on what has changed, what's an example, and then pinpoint the financial values with them.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So, a coaching session, maybe not dedicated to money talk, but really to reflection. And then, having them, quantify it for you on a conversation. And then I also heard another step that we didn't get into, but, validating with a decision maker like a CFO.
Right.
And do you do that work as the coach, or do you ask the coachee to do that work?
We ask the coach to get the values validated with somebody else in the organization. And it could be HR, it could be CFO, it could be their direct manager. They also have the option of not getting it validated. So they'll typically enter these values into our system that automates the reports for them. And they have the option to say, yes, it was validated. Here's who it was validated by, or no, it was not validated.
Excellent.
When you're coaching a CEO, you're most likely not going to get it validated, or there might be some instances where you don't get it validated, and that's okay. That it is what it is. That's the data.
Okay. Great. Dr. Nadine.
Yes, gosh, I'm just so excited about this topic. I can barely contain myself. Lisa and Tanya, yes, so I was thinking about the flip side of that. So I had calculated the cost of not hiring a coach. And I had calculated that it was $311,250. And so we're talking about the executive search costs, the costs by the internal recruiting team, scheduling interviewings, drafting evaluations, reference checks, the opportunity costs assumed by the C-suite, is not having somebody in that seat, or having somebody who's there but absent, the lost productivity. And so that's another way of, like, when you don't hire a coach, when somebody does need coaching, it's huge costs to the organization, and it's a massive culture drag too, which I know Tanya talks a lot about too, is about the culture of performance and learning. And if you've got kind of a bad apple there that needs coaching and doesn't get it, it costs in a myriad of ways. Another thing I wanted to expand on that Lisa was talking about, and Tanya to some extent too, is how do you measure the increased competencies? So what I did is I had taken some work that was outlined by Korn Ferry, and they put together like the top 10 leadership executive competencies that have the most value. And if one is able, and we have a lot of coaches here, to do a pre-coaching 360, then do the intervention, which is the goal setting for the coaching and the actual work for the coaching, and then do a post-coaching 360, we might be able to see some movement on self-awareness, interpersonal relationships, listening skills, empathy, influence, leading during times of change, communication, strategic thinking, building executive teams, working with ambiguity, listening skills, empathy. You know, these were the top 10 competencies that had been identified by Korn Ferry. And so that's kind of on a very individualized way, maybe a way to measure competencies and try and measure the increase in the competencies.
So Dr. Nadine, there was a question, 311,000 is what you identified. And so how do you present that to clients? Because a client could say, it's the cost of not doing business. And I see a lot of comments, people love that. So how do you go in and approach that? Because if they didn't spend the money, well, yes, it's a cost savings, but like, how do you justify that? Or how do you approach that with decision makers?
Yes, exactly. And this goes to my fourth way of measuring, which is the person answering the question. So you got to put, we're all good coaches, so we're always listening for what's behind the question. So first of all, who's asking? Is it somebody like Paul, a CFO, or is it the manager of the executive who needs the coaching, or is it the coaching client, or is it a fellow coach? So we want to get underneath and see who's asking, why, and who's answering. So I'm going to put in the chat things to ask yourself, whether you're the head of HR, in L&D, a coach, a CFO, the CEO. Why is this question being asked? And the smart answer is the person who can toggle between, am I going to talk about competencies on this question? Am I going to talk about the financial aspect, either the gain or the loss of business and culture? Am I able to toggle? So that's kind of an answer that has another question. Maybe I'm a consultant at heart. But that's my approach there, is to really start to ask, why is this question being asked right now and who's answering?
So when you've gone in to ask the question or to introduce the concept of, it's a loss of 311,000 if you don't engage a coach, what has been a real success story where the light bulb's gone off? Can you just share that before we move on to Tanya?
Sure. I think it's really an emotional response. I mean, we really like to make it part art, part science, and we like to value our science. But the person is often just like, oh my gosh, this is untenable. It's unsustainable. We need some help. And yes, it's costing me an arm and a leg to not do something. Can you please come and help us?
Interesting.
And soon I'll start to move into, the 4 phases of the 4 steps of coaching and kind of what comes next, so that there's hope, because often by then it's that somebody's lost hope.
Okay. Interesting. Tanya, what about you? I'm sure I'm messing up your name. I go from that famous ice skater to your name. It's like, I want to add an O. I'm sure you get this all the time.
And my maiden name was Harvey. So for those in the States, that'll give you a giggle because it was very close to that lovely ice skater. But we digress. So it is Tanya. So if I take some of what Nadine has said, and which I agree with, and take it the next step. So I think the who is asking is really important. And then what is that person measured on? So all of those things about taking the baseline and seeing the competencies improve, all of that I think you have to do. But then for that individual, And for the organization, it's the so what. So my competencies improved on these 5 areas. So what? And I think that's where Nadine was getting to. If you're talking to the CHRO, it might be, and guess what? The engagement scores for my team went up. I lost less top performers. Whereas if you're talking to your business executive, you might need to talk about an increase in revenue or a decrease in cost or something more financial. So I think those are important. An example that I will give, and I've kind of been watching the chat. When I think about coaching, so I'm thinking about it more with an OD hat on. So more with again, the coaching that we do on an individual level is incredibly important. And to help organizations transform, how do you start to coach on a much broader scale so that you can leapfrog an organization in addition to coaching of each and every individual? So it's really thinking about how do you make expectations transparent? So let me use just an example of, it's very important that people have the right skills in this day and age, and that their skills are kept up to date, because skills change so much. Companies go out of business if people and companies don't have the right skills. So developing expertise. How do you do that? How do you do that in a way that coaches an organization for the organization to help the people gain that expertise, but that an employee starts to coach themselves to also start to gain that expertise. So making whatever skills are super important to your business in the market very transparent, and then building it into a system of how does that tie to your performance management? How does that tie to career conversations? How does that tie to your learning programs? How does it tie to your coaching programs? How does it tie to the concept of continual feedback, whether it's up, down, vertically, all of that? So one specific example I'll share is when I was at IBM, we created these things called digital badges, which are basically saying if you did certain activities, whether it be learning and or gaining of expertise, that you gained a digital badge. Well, you can imagine when we first rolled this concept out, we had quite a few business leaders that thought, oh, that's hogwash, that's never going to work, et cetera, et cetera. What we were able to show is that by employees gaining these skills designated with the badges doesn't even mean, anything. It's more that they gained skills. We were able to demonstrate that this group of sellers increased their revenue and that we decreased turnover of the sellers that had higher skills. Wow. So you're now talking about coaching an organization of hundreds of people worldwide around skills. That's a very different, it's all coaching, but the concept of coaching, the concept of learning, the concept of scale in the work I do is really important. And then there was a question of how do you validate that? In our case, we did that business analysis, and then we had the finance team validate that we weren't just making the numbers up. So that was the validation that we had from that perspective.
I see Dr. Nadine and Lisa, you're both shaking your head. Do you want to add anything, Tanya? That's fascinating.
I love, when you think about all the different ways to collect data and what you're measuring, I love that you identified these badges as essentially your measures of what people were doing. It's a brilliant concept and a really great example.
The interesting part about that, when you think about it from an organizational perspective, when we first rolled out badges, the business didn't want to pay for them. When you start to show the engagement and the ROI on the badges, the business units would ask me every year, where do I send my check? So that ROI is really important to getting the buy-in, and being able to show that it matters, and it's the so what behind whatever work that you're doing.
I just want to chime in one more thing that I love so much about that example, Tanya, is that you're taking the conversation around proving coaching off the table. So the conversation is not about the value of coaching, it's about the value of these skills, which is, I think, such a great way to position what it is that we're doing when we're measuring. It's not we're proving coaching, we're proving that this change or what this person has worked on has led to an impact that's valuable to the organization.
And there was just a question around badges for self-awareness. And if I understand correctly, what I heard you say is self-awareness could definitely be part of the digital badge, but you measured the overall output of the group who had the digital badges, regardless of what the skills were, to see how they evolved, employee turnover, right? And so it was the end result of that group. Is that right, Tanya?
Yep. Because what I've learned over time is you always have to get to the so what. So they gained a digital badge. So what? So they increased their competencies on whatever 360. So what? And when I keep asking myself kind of the so what, the so what, the so what, that ultimately gets you to what is the business value, whether it be for the individual, for the company, for the group, that really matters. And so that has been a real learning point for me over time with ROI.
One of the questions that's come up repeatedly during this chat is really the ROI measure and the difference between training and coaching. Do you all have any thoughts on that you'd like to share? I know it wasn't one of the questions, but I just want to throw it out there. It's come up like, I don't know how many times, but.
I'd like to go back. Sorry
Yeah,
about the so
it's okay.
what. This is what happens when
I
you
know.
get a panel like this. I'd like to point to a woman, Vicky Tenhaken, and she did a study about how 100-year-old companies survive. And it was really a very extensive piece of work that she did, I'd say maybe 15 years ago, that speaks directly to the so what. So she found that really there were three things. One is to protect the culture, but continue to grow it. Two, grow competence, which is basically what we've been talking about, is growing competencies, leadership competencies. And then the third was act ahead of the need to change. And so this really speaks to how these companies have not only stayed in business for 100 years, but really continued to grow and thrive, and they're still here with us now. And so when you were talking about the so what, I'm reminded of her work. I'll put her name in the chats.
Yeah,
and I'll put you back on track about coaching versus training.
And the
which I
ROI
think is the
measure.
question.
Yeah, and the ROI measure. Is there a difference? I mean, yeah, go ahead. Tanya, did you have a thought on that?
So I have again, I'm looking at this from a systematic organization standpoint. And when I think about it, I back up, right? So when I talk to clients, there almost isn't a CEO out there that doesn't say that one of their key pain points or priorities are their people and what skills, experience, and competencies their people have. And that's really cross industry. And so if you think about that, then how do you grow people, skills, competencies? To me, that's what's shifted, as opposed to thinking, well, the only levers we have to do that is send a person to a training class. Now, the way you do that is through coaching, whether it's individual, it's team, but it's peer-to-peer learning, it's training, whether it be a YouTube video or reading an article or going out there and teaching yourself to code. People learn differently. And then just the concept of mentoring, not the old school kind of hooking you up with the mentor, but to me, it's less about training or coaching. It's what ecosystem of interventions do you provide and or encourage people to take advantage of them to help them learn and grow? That's the way I think about it.
Yeah, a holistic approach all the way around. Lisa, what about you?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think in the same ways, and there probably isn't a coach here who has never done some training during coaching. There are times when training comes into the conversation because it's the most relevant thing that our coachee needs in the moment. So I think of, reading a book, listening to a podcast, going online, the YouTube videos, working with a mentor, doing peer coaching. There are so many tools. As it is that kind of catchphrase. Now more than ever, there is more available, even after the pandemic, because there's all these course creators that are now online, or all these leadership development companies that now have online courses that you can sign up for as an individual. So there is so much available. From a business perspective, as a decision maker of an organization, you're thinking about what's our best investment. So then the topic of ROI becomes especially important when you're thinking about, okay, if we spend $100,000 in coaching, are we going to see what we need? Or would a training program be better? Would a book club be better use of our money? So, they want people who lead those functional areas have to make those decisions. So that's why the ROI becomes so important. But I do see that all of these can blend together. In coaching, we might refer a book, or we might mention a book or a podcast or something else that adds to the overall coaching experience.
I want to just put a plug in for metaphors and storytelling. And so, sometimes in these conversations we get, and rightly so, really into like the $311,000 and $250 worth of, of ROI, that I often use Suits, the TV show Suits, with Harvey Specter and the senior partner at the top at one of the top firms. There's like the strategist, the politician, we had the high performer, we had the crook, we had Meghan Markle, the head of operations. We had the one with the strange and wacky behaviors, but he's such a genius, like many engineers I know, the technical expert. And so there's ways that we can talk about stories, success stories. Graduates from coaching programs can maybe share their stories too. And so, are we always keeping metaphors and stories in mind as we talk about our work? Or do we just bring it up when it's, time for more ROI or more budget, to fund our coaching programs? And so this is really just a good way that I found to keep it alive.
That brings up a question for me, Dr. Nadine, around stories, right? Of how important is it for all of you, as you think about this, to capture the themes from client stories, to bring those forward and to inform the culture? Because if we are using stories, there's power in that. How do you harness that to then, make it maybe an intangible, measure of ROI, but how do you do that? Go ahead, Dr. Nadine, do you have a thought, or Tanya?
How about my colleagues? Tanya?
Okay, Lisa.
I can go.
Yeah.
It's back to situational. I just really want the audience and the participants here to think about, do I know when to pull out the ROI that's hard dollars and cents, an amusing and fascinating story? Or maybe it's not me. Maybe I put a coaching client or a graduate words out there and tell that story too. But I think it's really, just like we're all very well trained coaches, really, why is that person asking? And then learning from my colleague Tanya, so what? Right? What's the other person so what gonna be? But I use stories a lot.
Lisa, how about for you? Are stories important to capture themes from stories or to share?
Absolutely. I think part of what is in story is context, and context is usually contains the need for why coaching was needed. So, context is a part of that story. When I think about the money talk, many times that money talk is almost like a story. That's how we're landing on the financial values, is listening to their story of how did they apply what they were learning? How did they influence decision makers? What was the impact of that? It is a story, and we're putting a financial value on that story. So that's the way I sort of think about story in the context of ROI.
Tanya, when you think of the whole ecosystem, right? The culture of the company, from, organizational, L&D, individual, how do you capture stories beyond the digital badge to show, ROI?
I think stories are incredibly important. And they're important. So I thought it was a great point by Nadine. They're important because a good story is powerful and evokes emotion. And again, understanding that context, understanding who you're talking to, they care about different things. I work with a group of engineers now. A story can be effective, but I know that I better have the numbers. There are other people that, yeah, you might need the numbers, but the story is going to work more. So I do think that the context is important. I think the other thing with storytelling when it comes to an organizational perspective is sometimes it helps people see what they can do. So a lot of times, if you're trying to help an organization move towards a new skill or move towards new behaviors, it feels hard, or it feels like I can't do that. So I have found that a lot of times having people tell their own stories can be very powerful, because then they can start to see some of themselves in the stories that they're hearing.
So as we get,
I'd
go
like
ahead.
to add just a key about, because I think Tanya's talking about how do you tell the story. And so I just know that a lot of my colleagues in learning and development and HR, we get lost in the process. We love to describe the 4 steps of the coaching engagement. But when I tell a story, I have to remind myself to start with the takeaway first, and then to appeal to the emotion of the situation. Also to keep it simple. I can get lost in my own storytelling if I'm not careful, because I'm just in love with the story. But I have to remember I'm talking so I can be understood by the other person. So I have to keep it really simple and remember the so what for them. And then also about like, who's the hero, right? Every story has a hero. So to make the coaching client and their manager, or whoever's funding the effort, to make them the true heroes, not the folks in L&D or OD, not the coach, certainly not the coach. But they really have to, shine in the story for having made the right investment for the company.
So I think we're getting ready to wrap up here in a few minutes. I'm wondering if you could share a concrete idea that some of the audience members might take back to their workplace today as they think about ROI. And Lisa, let's start with you.
All right. Concrete idea. One thing that you could start doing, if you're not already doing it, is when you're concluding your coaching engagement, is to do a debrief. And if you're not invested in some type of assessment tool or some kind of measurement system, simply asking your coachee, what do you believe are the top 5 ways that you grew over this time that we worked together? And then asking them to provide a rating. It's even a bonus if you can ask their manager to also provide a rating on those same skills. That's one thing you can do. It's extra credit, gold star, if you also then include the money talk, and you can download the Money Talk from my website at myexcelia.com. There's a free Money Talk guide there that you can download and start to use that and start to practice with having that conversation, which is connected to story in ways of finding the financial ROI. But that's an easy way to get started.
One of the questions that came up was, how do you approach the decision maker to quantify the measure, the financial measure, once you've had the money talk?
Right. So then you would take all of your notes and you'd meet with that manager to say that you'd like to do a debrief. You could even do a 3-way, but you'd like to do a debrief and share what your client has provided their overall impacts to be. You can share it with them at that time. You can also ask them for some ratings if that's how you're capturing ratings on skills. But then you'll share those financial values and walk through them one by one and ask them for their perspective. Do those look like valid measures? If not, what would they change? Or what questions might they have that they'd like you to go back and ask a little bit more about of that coachee? Typically what I find is that the people who are validating the measures, they tend to agree with the measures that have been presented.
So I guess we have a few more minutes, which is good because I want to ask you another question related to that. So
let me jump in. We
Yeah.
are here till 2:30.
That's
You know that.
perfect. So I
Yeah.
have time for
No,
another
you do not
question.
have to rush.
Okay, good. So Lisa, let me ask you this. Thanks, Margaret. So how important is it to set up the dashboard, quote unquote, before the individual coaching engagement to identify maybe some of the tangible and intangible measures? So therefore, when you have the money talk at the end and you go back to the decision maker, there's already buy-in. What's your thought around that?
So what did you say? What's the dashboard that they're using?
Yes. So, as a coach, how important is it to define those measures ahead of time? So,
Yep.
We're going to look at market share gain or, reduction of turnover or, navigating difficult conversations better or enhanced teamwork. Do you set those up before the coaching engagement?
Yeah, you can. So with the money talk, I always say there's 3 times you can use it. You can use it in the sales conversation. You may not land on financial values, or you may, depending on who you're speaking with. You can then also use the money talk when you're contracting and setting the coaching goals. So establishing the learning plan or the development plan, that's where you might bring the conversation back. And you may not land on financial metrics, but you're starting to get a sense of the things that they want to work on, which of those are ones that you might be able to monetize at the end. Again, the pressure is really light when we're talking about the financial values there. We want to focus on the overall goals of coaching, which typically tend to be softer in nature. They don't tend to be focused on the hard financial metrics when you're engaging at the start. But you can have the money talk then to start to prime the person for the conversation that you're going to have at the end, and also to give some level of focus. Then when you have the debrief, you're going to be asking about the ways that person has changed. Ideally, you're also capturing some measures on shift in competency or growth or progress in behaviors or skills. And then through that money talk conversation, you're asking about the ways that they've grown. You're listening for areas that can be monetized. You may then also go back to the original coaching plan, assuming that it hasn't shifted along the way. To your earlier point, it can shift along the way, but assuming it's still intact, you might also then refer back to the coaching plan, the original plan, and look for the ways that some of that change could be monetized. Sometimes we see a direct connection between this is what the original goal was and this is what we ended up with the end. Sometimes there's more of an overlap. So it's not a one-to-one matchup, but there's a nice overlap between what they started with and where you ended up.
I know we have a few minutes. I'm going to give everybody time. This one other question on this as you're talking. So if you make the agreement with someone like Tanya, who's the CHRO, around what the measures are, but then the CFO comes in and is like, that's too soft or that doesn't meet the need. What do you do in that case?
Good question. So you mean if you have the
Not that ever happened.
Not that that's ever happened. Yeah, it might also be that in your process, you may have some method of gathering stakeholder input before the engagement begins to understand what should be included in that coaching plan. So at the more senior level, you're likely meeting with multiple stakeholders, conducting interviews, gathering insights, hearing about specific examples, and then using that as a part of a way that you coach with your client to create the development plan. In other levels of the organization, you may not have a stakeholder interview like that, you may rely on a 360, or it may be that you don't even have a 360 that you're using. And so then you're creating the plan. And after the plan is created, you're meeting with the manager of that person to get some buy-in and support, walk through each of the things that that person is working on in the development plan and incorporating what the manager might have to say around that.
So it sounds like some pre-work ahead of time with decision makers or key people is essential.
Right.
Tanya, did you have anything to add as the CHRO? And we'll go then to Dr. Nadine's example. Did you have anything to add to that?
I don't. I was very much aligned with what Lisa said, and
Yeah.
I think that there's, you know, you might shift along the way, but I think it's critical to gather some of those baselines, because otherwise it gets everybody thinking like that, and otherwise you kind of get to the middle or the end and you're like, oh gosh. So full agreement.
Excellent. So Dr. Nadine, what's a concrete idea that people can take back to their workplace?
Yeah, so building on what my fine colleagues here and you, Paul, have been talking about is, so we're discussing how to monetize the ROI based on competencies, specifically increase competencies post a coaching effort. And so what I want to do is just drill down a little bit more on that. So if we take the C-suite level leader competencies outlined by Korn Ferry's research, and I just look at the one that talks, and it's the second most important one after self-awareness. And obviously it's hard to change unless the person's self-aware, and that is usually where the 360 comes in and the light bulb goes on for the coaching client. So once the self-awareness is there, then it's the interpersonal relationships, listening skills, and empathy. So if you don't have that, the negative impact is this inability to build and foster a collaborative work environment. So then the positive impact to the executive and the employees would be improved relationships with leadership, co-workers, stakeholders. And then the positive impact to the business is increased employee satisfaction, increased retention rates, decreased turnover. And, you know, very few of those things are measurable, but turnover is one that HR has been trying to measure the cost on for a very long time. And CFOs tend to agree that turnover is expensive, especially adding the layer of turnover of high performers and high potentials. So if you've got somebody who can't listen, can't build a team, then, you know, these are some of the business impacts and the costs associated with your best and brightest then leaving to the competitor. So there's something to.
Let me ask you as a follow-on to that. When you think about engaging a group, you know, the high potentials or measuring turnover, do you like to identify a specific group of people, like a cohort, and measure that cohort as they go through coaching? Or how do you select the group that gets evaluated? Or is it individual? Is it one-on-one?
Is that to me?
Yes.
Yes, so coaching programs, the larger ones that I've put in place for organizations are often linked to a leadership academy. And so by definition, then they tend to be high performers, high potentials, and also reflective of DEI. So an active effort to promote folks who are otherwise underrepresented. And so then by nature, then we are looking at high potentials, high performers. The second type of program that I've been able to put in place is just valuable people to the organization. So physician leaders, for example, or high value engineers. And so just by nature of their job description or their job title, they get selected into the coaching program. And there is like that whole methodology, you know, a pre-360, the coaching intervention, a post-360, and then of course the financial measures that go along with that. You know, these programs, I just have to say this, are, and I know we have somebody who designed an app here, but I think her app is different, is you know, we are in the process of being disrupted a little bit by some of these coaching apps. And I just want to be out there to say I support that. It's great to have something in your pocket that's going to be there for you. But there's really nothing like having that intimate, high trust, high yield relationship with an executive coach to work with you.
Yeah, as you were talking, it led me to think about how oftentimes, we go in in a coaching engagement and it turns into a consulting need. So how do you work with a consultant if they choose to bring one in, like an OD consultant? You've got your PhD and, OD or IO. How do you think about measuring and leveraging off that measurement, or do you?
In every proposal, I'll just answer for myself. In every proposal that I send out, obviously, I do put in the 4 ways that I measure any and if the organization wants to pay for that additional work, I'm happy to do it. But honestly, these questions usually come up at the very beginning, or in my organization if we haven't rolled it out yet. But mostly, folks see the benefits, and then, the question kind of fades.
Okay. So Tanya, Dr. Nadine mentioned DE&I, and there was a question in here. So I'm going to give you 2 about, measuring ROI on DE&I. Is something that's been, front and center for you in your organization, and then a concrete idea that people could take back? So I think the DE&I piece,
So,
yeah.
I haven't seen in my organization, and when I was with IBM, we didn't measure ROI on DE&I. We definitely measured it from the perspective of, are we seeing additional, not only diversity, but inclusion? And again, how does that then impact your culture and your outcomes? What's the so what of it? And so when I think about what are some things that you can do, starting small is always where I like to start. So whether you're in a one-on-one coaching initiative or you're doing a consulting engagement, find somebody who wants to understand the ROI as much as you do, if you haven't done this before. Because then you have a partner that's willing to work with you and think about it and get you the information you need and have some discovery conversations that might be a little different than what you would normally have. Think about how that person or that organization is measured. So at the end of the year, what matters? And that's the piece that you got to really hit on, whether it's an individual or it's an organization or a part of an organization. And I think if you start to think about it that way, and the couple things that are a little easier is taking the skills question and how to improving skills, competencies, and even soft skills, which I'll come to that. I saw the great conversation on that in the chat. How does improving that through coaching or whatever your intervention is result in the so what that they're measured on? Just start with a person, start with an initiative, start with a person, start with that little pilot. And the one thing that I will share with you from the soft skills, so first of all, I got quite a chuckle because we went through a whole naming exercise about what to call them. Soft skills, power skills, like you name it, it was there. But the bottom line, that the research that we've done, not only when I was at IBM, but other technology companies, what we're finding is the more technology increases, the more important soft skills are. And so, yeah, you can have computers, you can have AI, you can have all these things that do all of this stuff. But in the end, when you look at what I call a success profile, so what skills and competencies, for example, does a data scientist need to be successful? The analysis we did was 60% of the skills for a data scientist to be successful are soft skills. The model does most of the work. It's the person that's got to figure out what the heck the model means and what to do about it. So the business need is there. It's really kind of tying all of this together and really getting the so what.
Fascinating.
I'd like to add just a little bit to that and just speak to profiles for a minute. there. And I don't know if folks saw the TV program on the Myers-Briggs, totally tearing it apart. But, you know, things like the conflict profile, the Myers-Briggs, the 5 dynamics, the FIRO-B, the strong career inventory, you know, there's many of them. And maybe I'm more interested because I'm a psychologist as well, but I'm certified, and I'd say like 90% of the most common ones. And I will assign all of them to a coaching client right when I'm doing the 360. And something that I've been thinking more and more about the return on investment is how individualized it is, and how it can really be very personal to a coaching client. Let's say if they're an introvert who's conflict avoidant, but they're in an executive leader position, which of course there's going to be a lot of contact with people and conflict, especially in healthcare right now, and which is where I am. And so really the return on that investment is when somebody's personality or preferences are down one way, but they have to act another way on the job, is how many self-care techniques we can use and how many skills and competencies we can build for them so that they can continue to be in that job and be comfortable, even though some aspects of the job might be even contrary to their very nature. And that's really, as I said, very personal. It's not a programmatic or an organizational measure, but for that person to have that level of understanding, almost like an X-ray of who they are versus like the duties they have to perform, is has been really valuable, I think, to some of the folks that I've been working with.
You know, you raised an interesting point. I had a conversation this morning with a colleague about Leadership Circle and other tools, DISC and Myers-Briggs. Lisa, I'm curious for you, do you view those tools, Enneagram, any tool that a coach uses, do you view those as important to the ROI process? And if yes, how do you deploy those to make sure that it's captured?
Let's see. I hate using this answer, but this is it
No.
depends. It depends. You know,
Yeah,
it depends
okay.
on the situation. It depends on if the coachee is working on, let's say, understanding their own communication style. And one of their challenges is they work with somebody who's very abrupt or direct, and they're learning about the DISC communication styles and their own styles, a way to adjust. So then in that case, it's relevant. So that's important to ROI and measuring ROI, because then if that helps facilitate change or growth for that person, then we'll see an impact in the end. So that's the situation in which that would be, you know, valuable to ROI. I think it's fairly common, and nearly every coach who uses our system has assessments like this that they use as a part of their coaching engagement. In our system, we do not capture a baseline. We capture the midpoint progress and the final report. And the purpose of the midpoint feedback is to help the person see, this is how you're rating yourself so far, and here's how others are noticing how you're showing up differently. And so you can take that information and you could do something with it. You could say, I don't like how some people are seeing me in these areas, so I'm going to focus more on that. Or you're going to look at the data and say, gosh, all the efforts I've been making in my communication skills, they're really noticing that. Maybe I don't have to keep working on that as hard. So I like sharing the midpoint progress report as a way to create ownership for the data. We're not collecting data on them, we're collecting data with them. It's a part of their growth as well. So that's the way I think of assessments. All the external tools, if it's relevant to what they're working on, great. I love the midpoint progress report because it shows them where they're growing, where to focus. And I love the endpoint so that they can see, overall, this is how I've grown as rated by myself, as rated by my observers. And here's the impact I've made to the organization as well. It empowers them to take ownership for all of the growth that's occurred by working with you.
So Tanya, before you jump in, I see you nodding your head. So is your midpoint then your baseline, Lisa?
Well, I don't think of it as a baseline. I think of a
Okay.
baseline as a starting state before the intervention begins. So we don't collect a baseline.
You do not. So
Today,
the
we don't
midpoint
collect a
is your,
baseline.
is your
The
first
midpoint.
look. Okay, your
Right.
midpoint is.
Yeah.
Tanya, you were shaking that head. Talk to me.
Lisa and I are like, we're very much on the same page. She talks and I'm like, yep. So to me, it's even less about kind of where you take it. It's just the value, the impact, the conversations you're having. I mean, it just reminds me of the outcomes. Like somebody was asking me earlier today, what's the most impactful thing that you've done? And I've done some really cool things, but the things that are most impactful are the conversations that result from the things that Lisa just said. Because the work that we do here on the phone, what people remind me is this changes the trajectory of my life, of my family's life. And that's just, it's pretty cool to know that we're in the business that can can help change an organization. And that's something I'm really proud of, but it also changes individuals. And that's pretty cool.
One
I
thing
love that.
I want to
Changing.
just chime in, kind of jump off of what Tanya said, and maybe I kind of highlighted this before, is this topic of ROI has always been so important for either coaches in terms of landing business and making a business case, or for people who run programs for making a business case to executives for why their program should be continually funded or reinvested in. And the person that we always forget, but the one for whom this data is critical, is the coaching client. The data for them to have something documented that they have that they can put their hands on that shows their growth over a period of time. It's a historical record for them. It empowers them with specific talking points that they can say when they're having their performance conversation, when they're having career conversations, when they're advocating for a pay increase. It empowers them with specific data that's going to help them navigate those kinds of conversations. So I tend to overlook the value of the data back to the coachee, but it's actually very powerful for them.
Lisa, do you have a customized survey that you send out for Midpoint?
We have a set of standardized competencies. So we have 15 competencies in our system, which we develop through a process of looking at the research literature. What are people working on in coaching or leadership development, as well as in practice. So over 7 years of my consulting work, I looked at what were my clients having their clients work on. And then we came together, we melded a list of competencies together. Then we went through that same process to identify the skills. So we have a total of 147 skills in our system that we measure around midpoint and the endpoint for progress and growth.
Dr. Nadine, what about you? What are you hearing? Yeah.
Oh, I was just reflecting of, I mean, as brutal as it is, I do start at the beginning point as the 360 and the profiles. And I don't just use a couple of profiles. That would be like 7 or 8 profiles, because, the validity and the reliability, on some of these profiles, it's, mostly art, not so much the science. So I'm looking to have correlations between the profiles, the 360, and yeah, it's kind of a shock sometimes, I think, for some people, but I do start it at the beginning point, and then I do a post after. So I was just kind of reflecting on that. The other thing I was thinking about is the participants and us talking about return on investment. And I've often seen, especially new coaches, use this almost as a justification for, yes, I'm a good enough coach somehow. And I just invite people to, use the tools that you have and believe in yourself, and just connect with the client. Like, at the end of the day, that is what's going to grow your business, is your humanity and your understanding of yourself. Because as a coach, we have fancy tools, and that's what we spent this hour and a half talking about. But really, we are our own tool. Our coaching interventions come from really our own humanity and our experience. So just every year I'll take like 2 or 3 coaches that I'll bring in under the Dr. Nadine methodology. And I think one of them is here, Martine Sanabria, one of the deepest feeling coaches I've ever known. And I'll just, help them set their business and launch. And the obstacle that I see the most is self-doubt as coaches. And I think sometimes ROI, we're trying to overcome the self-doubt by these fancy measures, but just, get to know yourself as a coach. And then get to know your coaching client and just hang in with there and do your very best work. And back full circle, some coaches are great for the full life cycle, but some coaches are great just to help people on board, or just to help people get a new job, or just to help people move to China to set up that new business. And that's fantastic. It's fine to have coaches just for one area of transition.
Gosh, I mean, what a stimulating discussion. My brain is firing all over the place as we talk about, the holistic approach and really taking a step back and, looking at the entire system. Lisa, the money talk, I've never heard that before. The digital badge, I love that. That's a great idea. The employee lifecycle piece. Margaret, I know you're on the call telling me to be quiet. We have 7 minutes. I'm wondering,
Oh, no, I'm not. No. In fact, I wondered if I could inject a question.
Oh, good. Let's keep it going.
Yeah, thank you. Because we do have 7 minutes.
Good.
So I want to speak to the notion of psychological growth as a force for well-being, and also and so Matthew Miller, you probably know Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy's book, The Deliberately Developmental Organization, and he did a keynote for one of our conferences a few years ago, and he mentioned, and I haven't found the data, maybe you guys have seen this, that when people have an opportunity to grow themselves, and by that I mean, when you're stressed, you're in over your head. When you grow, you can handle more with less stress. If you're growing your business, you want to grow yourself so you can do more with less stress. And so that is a force both of well-being, because you just feel better, you just have more impact with less friction and less. But also, if you want to grow I've used this argument when I've done large projects to C-suites, is that, well, if you want to grow your business, the people have to grow too. How are you going to grow the business if the people don't grow? So I just wondered if you ever measure this, think about it, data around that growth as both a force for organizational growth and also for well-being.
Excellent question. Tanya?
I think that the well-being piece, I've just seen start to come into more play than the past, and that's even before the pandemic. And so the answer is yes, but I think it is I have seen it relatively new. And the way that I'm seeing it is not work-life balance. It's not called that anymore. It's even sustaining high performance. How do you, especially as you're coaching senior leaders or you're working with organizations that have high caliber people, how do you help them sustain high performance? And so a big piece of that is wellness of mind, body, spirit. So I saw that come in prior to the pandemic. Now with the pandemic, I think it's really even further shifted the conversation to this concept of wellness, whole self, true integration of work life, as you see people's dogs and houses and laundry stacked up. And, I think there's just been a greater sense of empathy. And I think there have been different conversations that have been had in the pandemic. I had a 58-year-old man the other day break down into tears and confess he's suffering from terrible anxiety. I don't think that's a conversation that we would have had prior to the pandemic. So I do think it brings opportunities to start to expand what we're coaching and working on, as well as again, to me, this all just ties into the culture that we want to build, the people that we want, how you do sustain high performance, how you grow skills, all that.
Excellent.
I did a lot of research on this because writing my second book, Stressless Leadership. And what I basically came up with was that leaders every day have to do at least one thing for their physical, mental, emotional, community, and spiritual well-being. And if you every day have leaders who do that, they'll not only take care of themselves, but their teams and the organization. And in the last chapter that I called the Bendable Bamboo, which is about building a resilient organization, I went into areas that I never thought I would be writing about for a leadership book. And I even touched on spirituality and believing in the good in other people too as leaders. So I just kind of want to throw out there, and I'm putting in a study, and I can't even pronounce these people's names. They're Norwegian, but there is some research on that, some good solid research.
Thank you.
I'll just add to this topic. I also do some consulting work, research consulting work. We have a client that we started a project right before the pandemic, about 9 months before the pandemic, on happiness and well-being, and collected data through interviews as well as looking at Glassdoor ratings and using an analysis there, looking at the connection there. And that research project was put on pause during the pandemic. So they didn't want to overtax, the client didn't want to overtax the people who were providing interviews. So we'll be coming back to it. But certainly this topic has shifted. And I think to what nearly everybody is saying here, people have become more empathetic to the unique challenges that people have faced, some people being at home under stress. I know domestic violence has gone up, suicide has gone up, referrals to mental health practitioners has gone up during this time. So I think there's a greater sensitivity overall that has been a hard time for very, very many people.
Margaret, thank you for this opportunity. Really, what a phenomenal conversation.
Yes, and sadly, we've come to the close, and I wonder if you, Paul, and the panel could each leave us with one word that would summarize what you'd like us to remember. Lisa, what would your one word be?
Oh my goodness. Let's see. I guess, I'm at a loss to put on impact, creating impact.
And Dr. Nadine?
Heart.
Oh, lovely. Tanya?
I was going to say heart too, so I'll go with value.
Lovely. Paul?
Inspired.
Great. Well, we've had fun, and now we're done. Thank you. This is, you can see, I mean, I completely couldn't keep up with the chat. This has been a phenomenal experience for everyone here. And I think it's the beginning of an ongoing conversation. So I hope that we can welcome you back, and let's keep this going, because I think it's very important. So
Thank you.
Again, our deepest gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank
Bye,
you all.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.